I never thought I'd notice my friend's mom, until she whispered, "Don't worry. I'll take care of everything." The first time I stepped into her home, I wasn't sure what I expected. Familiar warmth? Casual chatter? Or the awkward sense of being a guest in someone else's space? My friend's mom, Claire, was already there, moving gracefully through the kitchen. The sunlight spilling through the windows highlighted her hair in soft amber tones. She glanced at me and smiled, not the polite, distant smile you often get from someone's parents, but a welcoming, quietly confident one that seemed to say, "You belong here, for now." I shifted nervously, balancing a small bag in my hands, trying to make myself look less like an intruder. Claire, noticing my hesitation, came over with a gentle step that barely made a sound. "Don't worry about anything," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority you only notice when you're really listening. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. It was brief, almost accidental, yet the warmth of her fingers lingered longer than it should have. There was something quietly magnetic about her presence. I found myself studying the way she moved, the easy confidence in her posture, the effortless grace of her gestures, the subtle way she leaned in when speaking, making the space between us feel smaller than it was. My heart raced without reason, my mind trying to tell me to pull back, to remind myself she was my friend's mother, yet my body betrayed me, leaning subtly closer as if drawn by some invisible force. The kitchen smelled faintly of baked bread and vanilla, homey, comforting scents that seemed to wrap around me like a warm blanket. I watched her set down a cup of tea on the counter, the steam curling lazily into the sunlight, and I realized I had never noticed these little details before, the way her fingers lingered on the counter, the soft hum of her voice as she muttered a remark to herself. It was mundane, ordinary, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. "Here," she said, handing me the tea. Our fingers brushed for a second longer than necessary. That small contact, a hand on mine, sent a shiver down my spine. I coughed awkwardly, trying to look casual, but she just smiled knowingly, as if she could see the storm of thoughts behind my eyes. That smile made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. We sat together at the kitchen table, and even in that simple act, there was an unspoken intimacy. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, floral but understated, lingering in the air, and the softness of her gaze when she looked at me. Conversation flowed easily, yet I was hyper-aware of every touch, every glance. A slight brush of her hand against mine as she reached for her cup, the tilt of her head as she laughed quietly at a joke, all of it built a tension I didn't fully understand. By the time I left that evening, my mind was spinning. Something had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. Claire wasn't just my friend's mom, she was a presence that lingered in my thoughts, a warmth I couldn't ignore, a quiet force that had drawn me into her orbit without a single word of intention. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, how did something so ordinary feel so charged? A few days after that first visit, I found myself back at Claire's house, this time with a small task in mind, fixing a minor problem for my friend. I had imagined it would be quick, straightforward, and completely mundane. But Claire, as always, had other plans. She was in the living room, moving with her usual calm efficiency, when I arrived. The moment I stepped in, there was an unmistakable ease in the way she glanced up, smiled, and waved me over. "You're here," she said softly, as if noting my presence was the most natural thing in the world. I could use a hand with this. It wasn't a grand gesture. Just a minor scheduling issue with a household delivery. But watching her handle it, calmly, decisively, without the slightest hint of stress, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was a fluidity to her movements, a quiet authority in her voice, that seemed to anchor the room. And yet, beneath it, there was an unspoken warmth, a patience, that invited me in rather than pushing me away. I tried to focus on the task, but my attention kept wandering. I noticed the subtle details, the soft click of her heels on the floor, the faint floral scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of brewed coffee, the slight tilt of her head as she assessed the situation. My fingers brushed against hers when we reached for the same envelope, a fleeting contact that sent a small, surprising jolt through me. She didn't pull back. Instead, she let her hand linger for just a fraction longer, as though acknowledging something neither of us dared to name. As she explained the solution, I realized how effortlessly she made me feel competent while simultaneously taking care of everything. There was a rhythm to her instructions, a warmth in her tone that suggested she had done this 1,000 times, and yet, in a way that never made me feel inferior. "Here, I'll handle this part," she said, her hand briefly resting on my forearm. That brief touch of a firm but gentle, was grounding, a tether to reality even as my thoughts began to spin. I admired her. Really admired her. Not just for her competence, but for the calm confidence that radiated from her, for the understated kindness that softened every action. I could feel a quiet, almost magnetic pull toward her, an awareness of her presence that made my own heartbeat louder. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an unspoken connection forming in the space between us. Even as we finished the task, she lingered near me, offering small reassurances with her hands lightly brushing mine, her eyes meeting mine in brief, knowing glances. I wanted to ask her something, anything, just to prolong the moment, but I held back, sensing the delicate balance of boundaries and unspoken intimacy. As I left, I realized that something had shifted again. The initial curiosity and intrigue from our first encounter had deepened into something more, a quiet admiration, a subtle emotional dependence, and a growing awareness of how much her presence affected me. She had a way of taking control without overstepping, of making me feel both supported and oddly, undeniably drawn toward her. And I couldn't stop thinking about how ordinary the moment felt, yet how charged it was with tension I couldn't yet name. It was late in the evening, the kind of quiet where even the house itself seemed to exhale and settle into silence. My friend had stepped out with plans of his own, leaving me alone in the living room with Claire. I told myself it wasn't unusual, I'd waited for him before, passed the time in the same space, but this night felt different. The atmosphere seemed weighted, more deliberate, as though the walls themselves were listening. Claire appeared from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea, steam curling from the porcelain. "You looked tired," she said softly, setting 1 cup down in front of me. The faint glow of the lamp illuminated her features, catching the warmth in her eyes. She didn't hover, didn't demand, just quietly sat down across from me. Her presence was both calming and unsettling all at once. I tried to keep the conversation light, a few jokes, small stories, but she didn't let me hide behind them. She leaned forward, her chin resting lightly on her hand, and asked, "What's really on your mind?" Her tone was gentle, not prying, but direct enough that I couldn't deflect. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't used to opening up so easily, especially not with her. But there was something about the way she looked at me, steady, unhurried, almost protective, that made the words come out before I could stop them. "I've just been overwhelmed lately," I admitted, my voice low. "Trying to figure out my next steps, making sense of things. Some days I feel like I'm just going through the motions." She nodded slowly, as though she understood more than I'd said. Her hand reached across the table, lightly brushing my wrist before resting there. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now," she whispered. The contact was subtle, but it carried weight. It was grounding, pulling me back from the chaos of my thoughts. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the silence between us charged but not uncomfortable. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant tick of a clock on the wall, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of my own pulse in my ears. I looked up, and for a brief second, our eyes locked in a way that made the air between us hum. Her gaze wasn't motherly or distant, it was something else entirely, attentive, deeply human, quietly vulnerable. I had to look away before I gave too much away. She didn't press further, didn't try to force more from me. Instead, she gave a small, understanding smile and tightened her fingers ever so slightly around my wrist, then released me as if to say, "I hear you, and that's enough." I sipped the tea, grateful for the warmth in my hands, though my chest felt warmer still. I realized then how rare it was to be listened to without judgment, without expectation. In her presence, my defenses fell away so easily, and that scared me almost as much as it comforted me. When she finally rose from her chair to tidy up, her hand grazed my shoulder, not long, not lingering, but enough to leave me with a sense of reassurance I couldn't shake. That night, lying awake in my own bed, her words echoed in my mind. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now." It was the kind of comfort I hadn't known I needed, and the kind of closeness I hadn't expected to find in her. The next few days passed quietly, almost uneventfully, yet every encounter with Claire felt charged in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of tension that demanded words, it was quieter, more insistent, building in glances, in the smallest touches, in the spaces between sentences. One afternoon, she asked me to help her with something small in the garden. The sun was gentle, the air warm, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. I followed her slowly, carrying a bag of tools, my eyes occasionally meeting hers. Each time our gazes locked, I felt a subtle jolt, a mixture of nervous excitement and something I couldn't quite name. We worked side by side, moving at a deliberate pace, talking about trivial things, the weather, the plants, our friends. But underneath the casual conversation, a tension lingered. When she leaned over to show me where to plant a flower, her hair brushed against my arm. The touch was fleeting, accidental, yet I felt it for longer than it lasted. I glanced at her, expecting her to notice my reaction, and she did, her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners in that knowing way, a subtle acknowledgement without words. The rhythm of the afternoon carried an intimacy that I wasn't prepared for. She would hand me a tool, our fingers brushing, and I'd feel a flutter in my chest. When I laughed at something she said, our eyes would meet, and she'd hold my gaze just a heartbeat too long before looking away. The hesitation in her movements mirrored my own, neither of us daring to cross the line, yet both aware of the magnetism between us. Later, we moved inside to escape the growing heat, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with glasses of iced tea. The sunlight shifted through the window, casting a warm glow over her face. I found myself studying her features, the curve of her lips as she spoke, the softness in her eyes, the way her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers occasionally brushing mine. There was an unspoken conversation happening in every glance, every subtle gesture, that spoke louder than words ever could. Even when our conversation turned to mundane topics, the silence between sentences was heavy with meaning. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the warmth radiating from her as she leaned slightly toward me to emphasize a point, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It was as though time had slowed, stretching the moments into something intimate, almost fragile. When the afternoon came to an end, and I prepared to leave, our eyes met one last time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that carried understanding, teasing, and something more I couldn't name. My chest tightened as I realized that the tension, subtle, unspoken, and unacknowledged, had grown into something undeniable. Walking home, I replayed the moments over and over. Every brush of her hand, every lingering glance, every quiet smile had left its mark on me. The attraction, though still unspoken and restrained, was impossible to ignore. I was caught between admiration, guilt, and longing, and for the first time, I felt as though I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. It was in these small, fleeting moments that I realized our connection was no longer just casual or friendly. It existed in every glance, every touch, and in the charged silences that stretched between us. And with every passing day, the magnetic pull toward her only grew stronger, though neither of us dared to name it yet. It was one of those evenings where the rain fell softly against the windows, a steady, soothing rhythm that seemed to amplify every sound inside the house. I had come over to return a book I'd borrowed from Claire, but when I arrived, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her forehead resting against her palm, eyes shadowed with fatigue. The normally composed warmth she radiated seemed frayed at the edges, and something in her posture made my chest tighten. "Rough day?" I asked quietly, hesitant to intrude. She looked up, and for a moment, her gaze held mine so fully that I felt exposed, as though she could see every hidden thought and doubt I carried. "You could say that," she murmured, voice low, almost weary. "Some days, everything feels heavier than it should." I moved closer, sitting down across from her. The space between us was charged, thick with unspoken words and tentative glances. My heart was racing, yet my movements were careful, deliberate, trying not to overstep the invisible boundary that hung between us. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly, my fingers brushing against the edge of the table. She hesitated, then nodded, her hand reaching for mine. It rested lightly on top, tentative but deliberate, a touch that conveyed trust and vulnerability all at once. As she spoke, I listened intently, feeling the rise and fall of her voice, the subtle tremor that betrayed the weight she carried. Her hand stayed over mine, warm and grounding, and I realized I wanted to reach out further, to offer comfort in ways words couldn't express. My thumb brushed hers unconsciously, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers flexed slightly under mine, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness neither of us had dared to admit. The room was filled with the faint scent of her perfume, mingling with the aroma of brewing tea. The dim light from the lamp cast soft shadows, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek and the faint lines that gave her face depth and character. I wanted to tell her how much she mattered to me, how her strength and vulnerability moved me more than I could ever say, but the words caught in my throat. She paused, looking at me with those quiet, perceptive eyes. I don't usually let people in like this," she admitted softly. "But with you, it feels different." My chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to lean closer, to close the distance, yet I hesitated, aware of the social boundaries that still existed. Still, the tension between us was undeniable, a magnet pulling us closer even as reason whispered caution. For a long moment, we simply sat there, fingers touching, breathing synchronized, eyes locked in a silent conversation that needed no words. The rain continued to fall outside, the world shrinking until it was just the two of us, suspended in a fragile, electrifying intimacy. When she finally withdrew her hand, it was gentle, but the lingering warmth remained. That night, I left her house feeling a mix of exhilaration and anxiety. The tension between us had reached a peak, a delicate, almost unbearable closeness that neither of us could ignore. It was clear now, the bond we shared had shifted. It wasn't just admiration or comfort anymore. Desire, restrained yet palpable, had entered the space between us, leaving me questioning boundaries, emotions, and the future. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I found myself back at Claire's house. The sky outside was pale, the kind of soft gray that made the world feel gentle and still. I had come over under the pretense of helping her with a small household task, but both of us knew the reason was something more. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, her hair loosely tied back, an apron dusted with flour. For a moment, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that made my chest tighten. There was no pretense in her gaze, no motherly detachment, no polite distance. Just her, and the quiet invitation that made me want to stay, even if I didn't fully understand why. We moved through the morning routine almost automatically, chopping vegetables, tidying the counters, exchanging small smiles and brief touches. Each brush of her hand against mine, each accidental contact as we reached for the same utensil, carried a weight that neither of us spoke aloud. The air was filled with the faint scent of herbs and coffee, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the windows, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator, an ordinary domesticity made extraordinary by our shared presence. At one point, she paused, turning to me with a seriousness that made my heart skip. "I need to say something," she began, her voice low and steady, yet carrying a vulnerability I had rarely seen. She took a step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. "I've felt something for you," she admitted. "And I can't pretend it isn't real, even if it's complicated." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The words I had been afraid to speak, that I had been keeping buried behind hesitation and social boundaries, surfaced in my chest, aching to be released. I feel the same," I whispered, almost afraid that speaking them aloud would shatter the fragile moment. "I've tried to ignore it, but I can't." Her eyes softened, a mixture of relief and quiet joy flickering across her face. She reached out, letting her hand rest lightly on mine. The warmth of her fingers, the deliberate pressure, was grounding, comforting, and electric all at once. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. In that slow, deliberate touch, the unspoken tension of weeks dissolved into something real, tangible, and intimate. We talked quietly, honestly, about boundaries, fears, and what this connection might mean. There was hesitation, yes, the age difference, social perception, the complexity of our lives, but there was also trust, respect, and a shared understanding that made the uncertainty feel less daunting. Every word, every glance, every subtle gesture deepened the bond between us. Eventually, she reached out and brushed her fingers against my cheek, a gentle, lingering touch that left me breathless. I leaned in slightly, not out of urgency, but to match the closeness she offered. It was a slow, deliberate affirmation of what we had both felt for so long, a quiet, YouTube-safe intimacy that spoke volumes without a single word of passion. By the time I left that morning, the weight of uncertainty had lifted. We had acknowledged our feelings, embraced the vulnerability, and allowed the connection to exist fully in the moment. It was not the end of our journey, perhaps far from it, but it was the moment everything changed, and the tension that had haunted our encounters finally found its resolution. The weeks that followed felt like a careful dance, one step forward, one step back, yet every movement deliberate, honest, and filled with a growing sense of trust. I found myself returning to Claire's house often, each visit steeped in a quiet anticipation that made my heart both nervous and light. The world outside felt distant, as though time had carved a small, private space where only the two of us existed. One evening, after a shared meal and the easy laughter that had become a rhythm between us, we sat together on the sofa. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a lamp, the hum of the refrigerator a gentle accompaniment to the silence that stretched comfortably between us. I watched her, noting the subtle curve of her smile, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the warmth radiating from her presence. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had felt from the beginning, that her presence had become essential, grounding, and deeply comforting in a way I couldn't ignore. She noticed my gaze and didn't look away. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing mine before resting there fully. "You know," she said softly, "I never expected this. I didn't expect to feel this connection with someone so much younger, someone who wasn't part of my life in that way." Her voice was calm, steady, yet tinged with vulnerability. "But here we are." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth and reassurance in that small contact. "I didn't expect it either," I admitted. "But I can't imagine pretending it isn't real." For a moment, we simply sat together, hands entwined, breathing in the comfort of each other's presence. The world outside, with its noise and judgment and social expectations, seemed irrelevant. What mattered was this, the quiet honesty between us, the trust that had been built through small touches, lingering glances, shared laughter, and unspoken understanding. We talked, not just about feelings, but about life, the challenges, the boundaries, the future. She was candid about her concerns, the social complexities, and the age difference that made others raise eyebrows. I shared my own fears, my uncertainty, and the guilt I sometimes felt for the intensity of my attraction. And yet, through every word, there was acceptance. Mutual respect that allowed our bond to exist without forcing it into something it wasn't ready to be. When the conversation drew to a natural pause, she leaned slightly closer, brushing a soft kiss across my cheek. A gesture simple in its execution, yet monumental in meaning. It wasn't just affection, it was acknowledgement, reassurance, and a promise all at once. I felt a warmth spread through me, the tension of months finally giving way to something steady, secure, and profoundly intimate. By the time I left that evening, the weight of hesitation had lifted. We had reached a resolution, one not defined by societal expectations, nor by fear, but by honesty and trust. Our connection was real, meaningful, and mutual, and though the road ahead would hold its own complexities, we had each other to navigate it. And as I walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, I realized that some relationships don't need to follow the expected path to be significant. Some connections are measured not by conventional milestones, but by the small, quiet moments that linger long after the world moves on, by the warmth of a hand held, a glance that says more than words, and the knowledge that, in each other, we had found something lasting, something true.